Hey, thank you all for joining. I'm Joe Sheppers, and I'm a part of the marketing and sales industrial team here at Union Pacific. Today, we're here to talk about the bipartisan infrastructure law and how it will impact the industrial markets. So just for some quick context, this law allots for 192 billion of funding for additional road, bridge, airport, and port type of construction projects. And as you can imagine, these projects are going to require a wide variety of materials, different types of commodities such as metals, and in the metals sector, bars, beams, rods, asphalt, cement, aggregate, and many other construction type projects. So our intent today is we'll dig into the details of what types of projects the infrastructure law dollars are earmarked for, where those funds are going, what are anticipated start dates, and finally, how can you get your commodities to the project sites? So our hope is that you leave here today armed with knowledge about how the law will impact your business and how to plan ahead for growth. So joining me today, right here. So joining me today, we have two experts who have generously agreed to share their knowledge with us, Alex Etchen and Jacque Bendon. So Alex is a senior director for infrastructure advancements for the Associated General Contractors. Alex is an expert in the bipartisan infrastructure law, and he's been carefully monitoring the implementation of this bill on behalf of the construction industry. Prior to his current role, Alex served as the Associated Administrator for Highway Policy and External Affairs for the Federal Highway Administration. He also served on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Clearly, we're excited to have Alex here. He brings a wealth of expertise in the federal infrastructure funding arena. Next, we're equally excited to be joined by Jacque Bendon. Jacque is our Vice President of Industrial here at Union Pacific. And Jacque is truly an expert at being able to provide transportation solutions to industrial products, receivers, and producers. So before we get started with our two presenters today, I'd first like to do just a little bit of housekeeping. The first item to address is just a quick legal disclaimer. This slide underscores that we won't be talking about price, contracts, or anything that may fall into the antitrust category. And then secondly, you'll notice that the chat has been disabled for this meeting, but you're welcome to ask questions at any time via the Q&A form. You'll see a QR code on each slide. Just scan that with your camera to submit a question, or you can also just click the link to get to the Q&A form. And we've saved time at the end of today's presentations to answer any questions following both Jacque and Alex's presentation. And one other thing to note is we are recording and transcribing this session today. So with that, I will turn it over to Alex Etchen to talk about the implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law and how it will impact industrial markets. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you all for having me today. Like you said, I'm here to talk about the bipartisan infrastructure law, or the BIL bill, also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA. So before we get started, I wanted to turn back the clock. And if you remember, at the start of 2021, we had an incoming new president, President Joe Biden, and a Democratic House and Senate coming in talking about infrastructure and the desire to do a large infrastructure bill. And this was something that Washington had been talking about for 5 or 6 years. And typical of Washington, it started with a debate about what is infrastructure. And there was not an agreement on what infrastructure was. A lot of Republicans willing to go along with the more traditional view of infrastructure, like roads, bridges, rail, airports, where you had a lot of Democrats saying, no, there needs to be a, quote, human infrastructure bill as well. And so quickly, the bills were separated into two. We're going to only be talking about the one on the left today, the $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure law that was signed into law about a year ago. Also, if you turn back and remember, President Biden came in really with four critical themes that he was trying to achieve in this bill. The first, combating climate change, ensuring racial equity. So on transportation, this was going to be a real focus on transit. And, you've probably heard a lot about reconnecting communities that the interstates may have divided decades ago. A real focus on organized labor. He ran on being the most pro-union president in American history, and a focus on bringing back domestic manufacturing. So in terms of transportation and infrastructure, this meant Buy America. Immediately after the bill was signed into law, you had 19 Republican senators joining the Democrats to pass this bill, and there was immediately kind of the tale of the two infrastructure bills. Of course, folks talking about the same bill. So you had Republicans like Senator Portman, who was a lead negotiator Republican of this bill, talking about how this bill was core infrastructure for things like roads, bridges, airports, rail. And that this was included permitting reforms. It was going to reduce the time it took to deliver these core infrastructure projects. Whereas over on the other side, you had President Biden immediately talking about how it was all about clean energy and good paying wages for workers and a focus on Buy America. Now, as we dive into the funding of this bill, there's always a lot of confusion here. It's a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, but you might have heard folks say, well, I heard it only spends $110 billion on roads and bridges, or I heard it's only a $550 billion infrastructure bill. And really what this comes down to is what is new infrastructure spending versus baseline spending. And so taking a look at what is baseline spending, what that means is the federal government was already spending money on certain infrastructure assets. So, your roads, bridges, transit systems. So those included some baseline spending, and then there was additional spending. So over here on the left column, you'll see it says new infrastructure investment. So this is where that $110 billion extra in roads and bridges came from. And you'll see there's $65 billion for broadband. Again, this is an area, broadband, that the federal government wasn't spending money on, that now they are. So this is all new spending. You move to the middle column. This is new spending plus baseline, and we've pulled out what is for construction. At the Associated General Contractors, that's what our construction companies were interested in, and that's what I think you all are interested in. So if you look here, you'll see there's actually $350 billion for roads and bridges, over $105 billion for transit. Back to the broadband example, you might say, well, wait a minute, I thought you said there's $65 billion for broadband. So there was $65 billion for broadband, with about $44 billion of it for broadband deployment. The other $20 billion was for broadband affordability programs. So again, this middle column is really what is in this bill and what is for construction, new plus baseline. You probably remember there was a very healthy debate on how to pay for this bill. Typically our roads and bridges are, a large majority of them are funded by the gas and diesel tax that you pay at the pump. Congress opted not to increase those. There was a discussion about potentially rolling back the Trump tax cuts. Congress opted not to do that. There was discussion about expanded IRS enforcement. They opted not to do that. And so you ask, how was it paid for? And it was truly just a patchwork of various paid-fors, a Medicare Part D rule delay, repurposing unspent COVID relief funds. So typically, it's been how the last few transportation bills have really been funded, through piecing together various pay-fors. So now, as soon as the bill was signed, you had a lot of questions about, okay, when is this money going out the door? What can we expect to see in terms of construction? So the rule of thumb here is, if there was a department or an agency already with existing programs that got plussed up under this bill, that money went out the fastest. If it was an agency that was getting a lump sum of money that had to put it out, it was going to take the longest. And the reason is they have to write all new requirements for these programs to figure out eligible applicants, eligible uses. So of course, the highway funding, the transit funding all got out the door very quickly. We're already in the second year of highway formula funds to states, so they've already put out about $104 billion of the $273 billion. There was dedicated funding for bridge programs. They've already got about $13 billion of that out the door of the $37 billion. You've heard a lot about the electric vehicle infrastructure program. They've already gotten about 2 billion out. Over on the transit side, about 20 billion. On airports, about 5 billion of the 20 billion. And then as a rule, the US Department of Transportation has a record amount of discretionary grant programs where these are state and local governments, county governments, et cetera, can apply for grants for large infrastructure projects. And they've gotten through about the first year of those large discretionary grant programs. And then the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, they've gotten the first year of funds out for those, about 7 billion. So on the slower end, you're looking at the broadband money, which is about $42 billion run out of the Department of Commerce. They have never put out broadband money before. This is totally new for them. We've had a lot of discussions with them. Congress wants them to prioritize areas that have the slowest broadband, the hardest to reach areas, and then the communities that can't afford broadband. So it's taking a long time to build those maps, write the rules. Likewise, on the Federal Railroad side, they are the slowest to get the money out at DOT, largely because the money that FRA was putting out was really small in comparison for some safety grants, where they got this huge plus up for passenger rail grants. Something else I flag for our members too is, you have to pay attention that, again, these are the dollars we consider construction, but it's different mode to mode. So for example, in transit, a lot of this funding is procurement of buses, whereas if you look over at the highway programs, it's about 90 to 95% of that money ends up going to construction. So in the next two slides, I'm going to veer away from the funding for a minute, just to give you some important context to things that we've seen since the bills have passed. When this bill passed, there was a lot of discussion. Is this bill going to cause inflation? And, we were explained to our members, this is very different than the COVID relief dollars that Congress passed, which were a one-time infusion of funds. These funds are going to be spent over 5 years, but because there's actually a period of availability for these funds, meaning the state or local government has 1 to 4 years to obligate them or commit them to a project, it's actually spent over 5 to 10 years. But what we have seen is, due to the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, world events in Ukraine, gas prices, we've seen an increase in construction materials and the availability of these materials. This shouldn't be anything new for you all. We're experiencing unprecedented inflation. Some of these materials are, twice or even triple the price of what our members were experiencing just 2 years ago. So we've surveyed our members. About 93% of the companies that belong to AGC are, complaining about long lead times for these materials, price increases, allocations, or, situations where they're promised less than they actually need for the project. And so what we've actually heard from some of our members is there's been cases where they can't even bid on a project because they're unable to get enough of the materials that they need to deliver that. Likewise, we're hearing that a lot of these, so if a state DOT, they're figuring out what projects they're going to let and put out for bid. And one thing we're hearing is, so their engineers put together these estimates for a project, for example, for a bridge project. And then the bids from the construction companies are coming in about 20% higher. So it's meaning that a lot of these states are having to reassess how many projects they can do because these bids are coming in so much higher. Likewise, the other big change I wanted to talk to you about today was so traditionally, the United States Department of Transportation programs have had a Buy America requirement for iron and steel. One of the priorities of the Biden administration was, to expand domestic manufacturing capabilities. This bill included expansion of Buy America policies into construction materials. Congress did decide to exempt cement, asphalt, and aggregates. As an association that was involved in getting that exemption, I can tell you one of the concerns and reasons for this exemption was there was concern about the negative impacts on climate change that could come with not exempting these. And a lot of these come in through barge, particularly if you live along a coast from the Caribbean, Mexico, Canada, and Congress didn't want to have any unintended consequences to the environment. So this is a huge expansion of policy. OMB, the Made in America office, is in charge of this. They've essentially decided to allow agencies and departments to decide on their own what is a construction material. Most agencies, including the U.S. Department of Transportation, initially put out a 6-month waiver saying, we need to examine this. The current rules for iron and steel are going to be in place for the next 6 months, but stay tuned. That waiver has since expired, and there's a lot of confusion among the construction industry, a lot of confusion among state DOTs, metropolitan planning organizations that do these projects. So what we've seen is a lot of state DOTs putting out their own guidance on which construction materials have to comply and which don't. And we're seeing that the various state guidances are conflicting with each other. So I think this is something that's really going to impact this bill. It's going to really drive up costs of these infrastructure projects even more than we're already seeing. We've surveyed our members and said, hey, if you don't get any further guidance on this, what's it going to mean? And they tell us that construction is the business of managing risk, and they will have to bid higher prices to account for that risk. And then finally, what's happened since passage of the bill? What can we expect beyond 2022? I mean, the months leading up to the election, we were getting at AGC questions from our members. What is the 2022 elections going to do to this bipartisan infrastructure law funding? If both chambers flip, if one chamber flips, the short answer is there's really not much that's going to change in terms of the funding for this bill. How Republicans are now in charge of the House. I think they'll go after some of the capital investment grant funding at the Federal Transit Agency, but really most of this money has already been put into the Highway Trust Fund, and is essentially in a lockbox that it'd be hard for them to claw back any of it. There's also questions in early 2022. There was a big delay in getting this money out because the federal government was operating under a continuing resolution, which forbid departments from standing up new programs or putting out new money, which created a big problem for this new infrastructure law. So the money was a good 3 to 4 months late in getting out the door that first year. That's not going to be the case again. Likewise, that first year, states were essentially getting a 30% increase of what they were getting before. So there was a questions and concerns about the capacity of being able to spend that money so quickly. Now that we're in year 2 of the bill, we're talking about 3 to 4% increases in funding. So it really won't be as big of an increase for government entities. And then, I already talked about Buy America, other regulatory impacts that are out there. There's the greenhouse gas performance measure that the Federal Highway Administration has put out that could really have some impacts on the types of infrastructure projects that are put out there. Likewise, I think the bill also included some permitting reforms, codifying President Trump's one federal decision, which would really put a 2-year timeline goal on issuing permits for these large infrastructure projects. Likewise, put page limits. We haven't seen the Biden administration implement that law, so to be determined on how much that change in the law will impact the future of the funding. And then obviously, I think the supply chain constraints, inflation could continue to impact this. We've surveyed our members. They do report to us that they've really seen a leveling off in terms of inflation as it relates to construction materials. They don't expect the prices to come down anytime soon, but they do think we've hit that ceiling. And then lastly, since this is going to print the future of earmarks. So earmarks were starting to return as this bill was being signed into law. There was not earmarks in this bill, but earmarks obviously make it easier to pass infrastructure bills, pass government funding bills. There was question now if the House would be in Republican control. Are earmarks here to stay? They've since had a vote on that, and it looks like they are. So with that, it looks like we are about at my time. So Joe, I'm going to kick it back over to you, but thank you again for having me.
Absolutely, and thank you, Alex. I think that was some tremendously valuable insight that you shared. I think we will all have an opportunity to learn a little bit more in the Q&A section. But right now, what I'd like to do is turn the controls over to Jacque Bendon, our Vice President of Union Pacific's industrial team here. And Jackie's going to talk a little bit about how Union Pacific can and rail can support any supply and demand shifts as a result of the infrastructure bill. Jacque, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Joe. So first of all, I want to start out by saying hello to all of our current customers who joined this. I saw your names on the list signed up. I'm just thrilled that you chose to spend time tuning in to this today. I value each of your partnerships with us, and I'm hoping that this webinar is going to be a catalyst for additional conversations between our teams in the near future. Similarly, I also want to thank all of those who aren't doing business with us yet. Hopefully our teams can talk with you in the future too. So I'm looking forward to that. And Alex, I want to thank Alex for all of his insights. As I go forward here, I'd like to share insights about how we at Union Pacific are thinking about this additional spending going forward. And really, we're looking at it with a lens toward transporting as much of the construction products as possible to the areas that are going to need it for construction. So as a quick reminder, I just want to level set everybody to our railroad again. We operate on the western 2/3 of the network. We have great access when you look at the map there to high density population centers. We also have great access to some not so high density population areas. So wherever you're looking to move product in the West, we will most likely have a solution for you. Now, if you don't have product originating on Union Pacific or destined to someplace off Union Pacific, the thing that I would point out is we've got great interline partnerships. We interchange thousands of shipments on a daily basis with our interline partners to the east, to the partners in Canada up north, and then we have the best access to Mexico with 6 gateways. The other thing I just want to point out here, and I'll spend more time about this, talking about this in a couple of slides here, but every year we spend about 15% of our revenue on capital. And that's to really grow and expand our network reach and support our customers. So I'll talk more about that. Now, the last thing I will say is why customers choose to ship rail is typically because you get great economic benefits. It's cheap. It's typically cheaper than truck, and you also have scalability, and then as well as it's the more environmentally friendly way to ship. Okay, so building off of Alex's comments about how the funding is being allocated, what we wanted to do is overlay the allocation by the state level in the West. So the dark blue states here, California, Texas, and Illinois, this is where over $10 billion is being allocated from the funds. The royal blue is 4 billion to 10 billion, and then the light blue is still under 4 billion. So not a lot to sneeze at there. I'm going to try to click forward here. Now, Shelley, I might have to have you help me out. Thank you. Okay. Sorry about that. What we wanted to do is put on the map our receivers. So these dots represent locations where we are currently delivering steel, construction, aggregates, minerals, asphalt. That's where we're delivering product today. Now, if we layer on the yellow dots, these are going to be Loop Transload. And Loop, for those of you who don't know, that's going to be our subsidiary logistics company. And what they provide is they provide logistics expertise for people who might not be as familiar as with rail as some shippers are. They also provide solutions for customers who aren't rail served direct. So if you have a location where you don't have a rail spur, you can still take advantage of the economies of rail by using a Loop Transload or any other transload. So what we would do is we would work with the trucking company to either come get the product or take the product to the final destination. So what you want to take away from this slide here is really that we have great access to all of the states who are going to be receiving some of this funding. Now, if we can move to the next slide. Talking about investments. So I mentioned that every year we spend about 15% of our revenue back into the company. Many of you customers also are very capital intensive. So about 55% of our capital is spent on hardening the infrastructure. So it goes right back into the existing infrastructure we have. Another big portion, about 20%, is spent on expanding our network, and we call that commercial facilities. So this is things like expanding our terminals so that we can handle more carloads. It's things like extending our sidings so that we can add carload density to manifest shipments and build longer manifest trains. And it's things like building out rail to customers that may or may not be served. That are not served today. So this year, we're going to spend about $600 million of a $3.4 billion budget on growth, that capacity improvements. In addition, we are spending $300 million on freight cars. And so that is the largest number of dollars we've spent on freight cars since 2015. So I say all this to just really emphasize the point that if we have business growth opportunities, we really want to talk about those, and we are committed to spending if there's a mutual benefit to us to do so. The other thing I want to point out is over the next 3 years, we have made a huge commitment on modernizing our locomotive fleet. So we're going to spend $1 billion over the next 3 years to really focus on reliability. So if you're one of our customers today, we're really focused on making sure the locomotive fleet is as reliable as possible. We're also working to modernize it to further improve our emissions and make us even more energy efficient. And then on the map, what I want to spend just a little bit of time on here is I mentioned commercial facilities. You're going to see where we're spending that money by the green dots. So those green dots are all through our network, but they're really predominantly in the South. So when we think of Texas and all of the customers who are investing in Texas, whether it's petrochemicals, we've got chip manufacturers being built there, auto assembly plants. We are anticipating that customers are going to need to ship more rail, are going to want to ship more rail, so we are investing in anticipation of that. And then the last thing I would mention here is related to Loop. Loop is a great logistics partner for us. We had the opportunity to purchase 2 new Loop transload facilities. One is in Phoenix and one is Southern California. Those are strategic destination markets for us and our customers, and we wanted to make sure that we have an outlet and a way to grow with the customers in those markets. And if we have opportunities to do that elsewhere, we'll take a look at that as well. Okay, and then just wrapping up here, when we think about shipping these heavy, bulky commodities and participating in the transportation of all the commodities that need to move to support these construction projects, it's our opinion here at UP that the best way to ship that is via rail. It's economical, like I mentioned, but it's also just energy efficient. And that's really good for the planet, right? So rail is typically 4 times more fuel efficient than truck. And we at UP, even though we're already so much more fuel efficient than truck, we've made a commitment to reduce our carbon emissions by 26% by 2030 off our 2018 base. The way we're going to achieve that is through the modernizations I talked about. We're also testing some technology with battery locomotives, and then we're also testing and working with the OEMs to increase the use of renewable fuel blends in our locomotives. So it's a big lift, but I think as you're going to see, we're going to demonstrate that we can be even more fuel efficient going forward. And then the last thing I would say is there's a lot of opportunities, I think, for all of us. A lot of our customers are under pressure to reduce waste. We'd love to talk with you about circularity and recycling some of your waste products back into the value chain. So those, we're seeing a marked increase in that, and we would love to participate in that with you. So that is how we're thinking about things at UP. The big takeaway for our customers is we are excited about the opportunity to handle the majority of this bulky freight that needs to move to the destination markets, and we're committed to investing if it's necessary. So reach out to your salesperson, talk with them about the projects that you have on your radar that you're interested in, and we'll see how we can work together. Joe, I'm going to turn it back to you now.
Sounds great, and thank you, Jacque. Again, some really insightful and helpful information here. So what's up next is we are going to shift to the Q&A portion. We've had some questions come in throughout both Jacque and Alex's presentation. So moderating the Q&A portion is Andrew Brady for us. Andrew is the Assistant Vice President of External Relations in Union Pacific's Washington, D.C. office. So Andrew, I'll hand it over to you to run the Q&A portion.
Thanks. Thank you, Joe. And I appreciate all the questions that were submitted. We got some in advance and some are coming in now. So we've got a wide range of questions, and I want to make sure that we do focus on questions for Alex in particular and take advantage of the expertise that we have with us. So we're going to start there. And I think a really good place to start looking at this one, pointing to your money out the door slide, Alex, will the funding be like spread out, spent equally over the sort of 5 to 10 year span that you talked about? Or will there be ebbs and flows or peak periods folks should expect?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the only real ebbs and flows, year one, you were going up 30%, for example, in highway spending. So that was a huge increase that states were going to be spending. Now, again, we were in a time of inflation, so I don't think that 34% was fully realized. I think the other ones I would flag again are, we're seeing a delay in the passenger rail money getting out the door. We're seeing a delay in the broadband money getting out the door. So we haven't really seen the demand from those. But then the other last one I would point to was, so states get their funds to spend on roads and bridges. There's been a lot of attention about bridges in poor condition throughout the country. Some of these are state-owned. Some of them are, owned by a county or a small township. And Congress, typically those funds for states to spend are really only spent on federal aid roadways or bridges on those roadways. But they actually dedicated, $27 billion for bridges. And a lot of these funds can be spent on county bridges, township bridges that typically didn't get federal spending. And I flagged those because they put out those funds and they said it's only going to be for 2 years of this 5-year bill, because they didn't want they wanted to be clear that this was not going to be a new federal role to, take care of township and county owned bridges. So that's one other area that I do think there'll be, a slowdown, because those funds will come to an end.
Thank you. Here's one, not on the money, but on sort of demand, I think, for products in these types of construction projects. So the question reads, can we expect a ripple effect in demand within industrial markets? So I think that's, should one market expect, to see an increase in demand before others? What does that look like in the construction industry?
Yeah, I think the materials used on highway, road, and bridges projects, again, they got a 34% increase. It's a 5-year bill, but really, I keep stressing to folks, it's a 5 to 10 year bill, because they have on the highway side 1 to 4 years to commit these funds. And if you're doing a large bridge rehabilitation project like the, Brent Spence Bridge, that wasn't starting to be spent in the first year of the bill. So those are going to really start to spend. I think we're going to see these larger projects coming to fruition in years 2, 3, and 4. If you look back at the history of infrastructure bills similar to this.
Okay. So what do you think? How do you handicap the ability of state DOTs? It sounded like most of this money was going to the states to be spent out and bid out for projects. The question is, what's being done to ensure the DOTs are prepared to execute the projects with this funding?
Well, I can tell you, at the federal level, the Federal Highway Administration, they're staffing up to make sure that they're there to provide the technical assistance that these State Department of Transportation and metropolitan planning organizations need to deliver these projects. I can also tell you, so it depends. Most of these funds are 80% federal, and then there has to be a non-federal match of about 20%. There was some concern that there's going to be some more rural states out there that with all this new federal funds out there, are they going to have enough non-federal sources to match these funds? I think that was a big concern early on. I think most of these states, though, are pushing their state legislator to take steps necessary to make sure that they don't leave these federal funds on the table.
Yeah, we hope to see that. We have a lot of questions, and it seems like there's a lot of concern and maybe even confusion on the Buy America, Build America portion. Is there an opportunity for companies who maybe don't currently can't meet the requirements currently? Are there ways to get exceptions? Are there exceptions? What should those companies do when they find themselves in that situation?
Yeah, so typically, and forgive me if you already know this, but so on the construction side, when members go to bid on the project, they go to the suppliers and ask for what they call a certification letter on that. Basically, what you're selling me is Buy America compliant. If there isn't something available in the U.S., they have to apply for a Buy America waiver. And those have been around for iron and steel. The problem is that this new Office of Management and Budget, Made in America office, is now requiring all departments that anybody that has a Buy America request, it has to come all the way up to the Office of Management and Budget for sign off. So, we've told our members it's like, making the school board sign off on every, sick notice that a parent sends in to their school. Just really unnecessary. Our other concern here is that it's going to get really politicized, like, if there is a Buy America waiver that comes in, a request that comes in, it should be put out for comment. And, that would provide the manufacturers that are in the U.S. the chance to say, hey, we actually do make that, or, we would be able to make that, but we have no interest because there's not a big enough market in the U.S. Whereas instead they end up just kind of getting, someone sits on them because they're, it's a politically toxic issue.
Gosh, that sounds complicated. Is there a way to, or are there efforts afoot to simplify that process or make it easier for companies to apply so they don't have to go through all that?
That's actually one of the things we've been meeting with the Made America office about and USDOT. There needs to be some kind of streamlined process, a form, something for them to fill out because, there also needs to be some transparency. When, USDOT receives a Buy America request, they need to be put on a big website so the public can know how many are out there. Because right now we don't know about them until the Office of Management and Budget approves it to be put out for comment.
Okay. Jacque, I'm going to turn to you for, there's two questions that are similar and they're in regards to our loops logistics that I think will be interesting. So the first is what types of commodities that fall under the industrial markets that are impacted by this infrastructure law does Loop handle? And then the second question, which I think you could probably work in, is where is the new transloading site that UP purchased in Southern California?
Okay, so Loop handles a variety of commodities, and I think they would be open to talking about any commodity. They have even started doing some hazmat commodities at certain locations. But on the construction side, we see metals, a lot of metals. You can do scrap, you can do minerals, whether that's like a lime or sand. You've also got lumber. So, and then you can do some aggregates too. So really they aren't too discerning when it comes to commodities. And like the railroad, they'll also look into whether or not they need to make an investment in storage or equipment to facilitate the loading and unloading of those commodities. Now, in Southern California, where we purchased was at Colton. And I will tell you, that's just one location. We have a lot of transload partners in California. So if that location does not work or is not quite the right spot, we should talk and just see what we can find for you.
Great, thanks. Alex, we had a number of questions, I think unsurprising, relating to rail infrastructure, specifically to connect customers or potential customers to the railroad. Looking at a couple here that are similar, will any funding be available to set up rail transload facilities? Or, for example, if a shipper may have a loadout on rail, but they don't have access to sort of a city core, is there money available for a new spur or a mainline switch? What does the funding look like for those kinds of opportunities?
Well, I can tell you, dedicating funds for freight infrastructure was something that was very bipartisan. And yes, there is a lot of funding in here. I would say most notably, there is in the discretionary pot of funding that the U.S. Department of Transportation gets. They have some grant programs that are for the really large infrastructure projects that are freight focused, specifically ones that are intermodal focused. So yes, there's the infra grant program and the mega grant program. These are for large freight programs, really focused at addressing freight bottlenecks, freight delays. And, in terms of eligible projects, they're again for freight rail projects. I think one of them, infra, says that it has to have or mega says that there has to be a public interest, but otherwise any freight rail project would be eligible. So again, the eligibility would be there. What you have to pay attention to is the eligible applicant. And for most of these grants, it's a state, it's a metropolitan planning organization, it's a county, township, tribe. So this is one where, a private company wouldn't be able to apply. They would have to make the case to their local or state government that this is a worthwhile project. We think you should apply. Likewise, there's some eligibilities for Amtrak to apply, but Amtrak, again, has to partner with the state or local government. So that's really what I would encourage folks to look at, is the eligible applicants.
All right, on the funding question, you talked about sort of the length of time that's going to go out, and now we've seen the increases. what happens, in the event of a possible recession, or Congress changes hands and they decide that maybe it's folks who want to cut government spending? Is there a risk of either of those things that this money could go away?
No, so most of the funding is funded out of the Highway Trust Fund. So it's a dedicated account. The pay-fors that I talked about earlier, that was money that was transferred into the Highway Trust Fund. So it's there to be spent out over the next 5 years. There was some funding that was funded through what they call advance appropriations. But again, that's going to be really hard for Republicans or anyone to claw back. There are then the third way it's funded is some programs, like I mentioned earlier, like the capital investment grants out of the Federal Transit Agency, they are subject to future appropriations. And those, I would say, are the most at risk, if you will, of future efforts to claw back funds.
Gotcha. All right, well, Jacque, question for you. When it comes to using rail, the question is, what type of planning and lead time would a potential customer need to use rail in our bid system?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I appreciate it being asked. It's really dependent on the business. And I just want to say to our existing customers, we know that this year has been a challenge for us. We got behind in hiring, and we're continuing to make progress toward those goals and have seen slow, steady, consistent improvement, and that we expect is going to continue. Now, labor this year has been the biggest challenge. And so what I would tell customers is, if you have a big project, earlier is better. And if we have to bring resources on, like people, it can take, anywhere from 3+ months, depending in the area, to hire and train additional people. So it takes about 14 people to onboard, 14 weeks to onboard new hires, and that doesn't include the actual going to market to hire them. So longer is always going to be better. What I would tell our manifest customers, though, we have a very robust manifest service and product here at Union Pacific. So if we have a service today and are running trains today, and we just want to fold in some new manifest carloads, that can be relatively more easy. It's on the unit train business that we really need to have good line of sight on what your goals are and what you're trying to accomplish. So always earlier is better. Typically more flexibility on manifest. And then it also comes down to whether or not we have cars available if you need cars. So have those conversations early with your sales manager.
So speaking of cars, Jacque, a question that came in was about rail car manufacturing capacity, but it says, how long will it take to manufacture and get new cars into the system? Which is really a question, I think, do we have the capacity to move this product?
And so I would tell you, earlier this year, we probably didn't have a whole lot of excess capacity when it came to cars, and it really is dependent on the car type. Now, as we're seeing the economy slow down, we do have some cars that are available, whether it's box cars, gondolas, center beams. So it's really going to depend on overall demand for those cars. And so if demand is very strong and cars need to go be manufactured, that can be a longer lead time, and it depends on the type of car that you want built. We've seen anything from about 6 months to longer.
Well, here's a benefit of having the live questions coming in. We do have someone asked for clarification, Jacque. If you could explain just clarify when you're talking about manifest versus unit train.
Oh yeah, great. Yeah, great question. So manifest is going to be very similar to hub and spoke air travel, right? So you are going to go, maybe you as a shipper want to send 5 cars to a destination. We're not going to run a 5-car train from your origin to your destination. What we're going to do is we're going to pick up your freight with a local, and then we're going to take it into a terminal, and we're going to combine it with other customers' freight who wants to go in the direction that you're going. And we're going to continue to sort it until we get it to the destination it's going to, where we deliver it with another local. So you could have anywhere from 1 to 3+ touches depending on where you're going to and from, and the service that we have existing available. A unit train is point to point. So let's say you have a lot of volume, you have over 100 cars you want to ship to one destination. We're going to work with you to run that train from origin to destination on a day that we mutually agree upon. And the thing about a unit train is that that is a dedicated service. So we look at that as a little bit more of a premium product. So there has to be density, there has to be good utilization of the assets, the locomotives, and the crews that we're putting toward that. So it really just depends on what project you are and volumes you're trying to move. But again, your salesperson would be the best place to start with that. And we'll design a transportation solution that works best for us.
Thanks for clarifying that. And Alex, we'll turn back to you and maybe ask you to reflect on sort of what happens next as kind of a final question here. You know, the bill funding, I think you said this is the first of 5 years, and the spend out being sort of 5 to 10. But what happens after the 5th year? Does the money does the new money go back down to where it was? Does it 2 years ago, or does it go down to 0? How does that work? Is there a cliff, or what does that debate look like?
Well, first of all, I don't even like to think about that far ahead, because that's going to be, it's to use your word, it really is going to be a cliff for Congress to deal with. Our infrastructure programs, the Highway Trust Fund, is still very largely funded by the gas and diesel tax. And, as more and more Americans buy hybrids and electric vehicles, the environmental benefits are great, but it does really deplete one of the biggest sources of revenue for the Highway Trust Fund and how we fund our roads and bridges. So there's going to be a real decision to be made by Congress. Do we want to maintain some form of a user fee to continue to have dedicated funding for our roads and bridges? Or are we going to continue to try to piece together pay-fors like they did with this bill? It's going to be a very, very big lift, because the gap between what we're spending and what we're bringing in keeps growing. And I sort of started with the gas and diesel tax haven't been increased since 1993, and they weren't indexed for inflation. So as you can imagine, over the last 30 years, we've lost significant purchase power with that money. So that gap of what we're spending versus what it brings in continues to grow. And like I said, we just grew our spending on roads and bridges, for example, about 30%. So yes, to use your word, there is going to be a huge cliff and a huge decision for Congress to make.
A lot of uncertainty there, but it sounds like there's still a significant amount of time where this current money is going to be getting out the door, and the demand for the folks on this webinar will be there.
Yes, we just entered year 2 of the bill, so the cliff is a long way away.
All right. Well, Joe, this might be a question for you, and I think it'll be a good way to wrap up the Q&A session. But folks asked about recording, if this recording or the slides will be available. So I'll kick that back to you to answer that and bring us home.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Andrew. And before I answer that, just one last thank you to Alex and Jacque. We really appreciate it. Great information. And so, yes, we will follow up today's webinar with an email. It'll have the recording as well as the presentation. And so for those of you who are able to join us today, feel free to share it within your organization. Included in that link or in that email, there'll be a link to a 3-question survey. And in that survey, it really just kind of, one of the cool things is we're going to ask for an opportunity if you want to suggest topics for future webinars. If you like this format, it's a quick 1 minute to fill it out. So please take some time to complete that. Additionally, we've covered a lot here today. So if you want to learn more, or if we didn't get to your questions, or if you have additional questions to ask, you can send an email to iija@up.com. If you're an existing customer, again, your sales rep will be happy to help you out or filter your questions to the right channels as well. And finally, if you'd like to see how a Rails solution can work for you, you can scan the QR code on the screen here or click the link to get a quote. So with that, wrapping it up today, thank you everyone who were in attendance. Thanks again to Alex and Jacque. And until next time, please everyone have a wonderful day and please be safe today. Thank you again.